All right, tremendous. It's time for Market Factors here on the Everything Guide to Sports Betting. It's VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. I'm Patrick Meagher, live from Vegas. The author of the Everything Guide to Sports Betting is Josh Appelbaum. We're talking UFC today, Ultimate Fighting Championship, and we're going to get into some of the market factors. We're going to start, Josh, with the public.
Yeah, so, really any sport you're betting on, you want to be conscious of how heavily bet a game is and what kind of action it's taking in from, obviously you'll have sharps across every sport, but your level of public betting can really go up or down based on the sport, the popularity of the fight or the game. And you want to be conscious of the fact that, the public, if they're heavy on a certain spot, that's going to increase your contrarian value to go the other way. Whereas a low bet sport or, a fight that doesn't get a lot of action, really there's no public to go against. So you can kind of throw away any perceived contrarian value overall. So I think what's important here is, looking to take advantage of public bias and placing yourself on the side of the house. It's much more important when you're looking at the card overall for the main events, your late night bouts, your big bouts that throughout the entire week have been the headliners and been getting all the media publicity and all the attention. Those big fights late night, especially what you mentioned, Patrick, a lot of dogs in these heavyweight matches, that's a situation where going against the grain can really set you apart and place yourself on kind of a good spot to be with the house instead of against the house, because they need, a lot of these dogs late to come through. And when they do, you can get a really good plus money payout. So again, the high ticket counts with these late night matches, especially when they're kicking off at, 11 p.m., they've had all day for these ticket counts to rise and rise and rise. So the bigger amount of public betting coming in creates more value to bet against that public. Now, on the other hand, you have a big card here, your preliminary matches. There's really not a lot of contrarian value there. There's less public on these small matches 3 or 4 hours before. So therefore, you can kind of throw that out the window. So keep an eye out for the timing of the bout, who's fighting. Is it a big name fighter that the public knows very well? But also, look at other things like rematches. The public loves a rematch, especially if it's pretty hyped and both fighters are well known, and you can kind of create a narrative of this big rematch where one guy wants to get revenge over the other. And it kind of reminds me doing some research about doubleheaders in baseball, where it's kind of a public narrative that in baseball, if you win the first game of the doubleheader, you're bound to lose the second, and they always split. But that's really not the case. The data doesn't bear that out. It's the same thing with fighters in rematches. A lot of times overall, from a lot of the data I looked at, about a little less than 2/3 of the time, the fighter who won that first fight ends up winning that second fight, the back-to-back one. So these are the public narratives that you don't want to fall into the trap of. Just because a lot of people are saying something or doing something or betting one way, you don't want to automatically be with the crowd. So these big matches, again, that take in all these bets, really, really important to try to go against the grain, zig while the public zags. And then another big factor here, Patrick, is the weigh-in. The weigh-in is kind of a media publicity kind of event where you get to see the guys. They go nose to nose and square off and grin at each other. But it's really, really important, and you should really pay attention to the weigh-in, specifically when you're looking at weight cutting. So basically, the weigh-in, usually it's maybe a Friday morning. The bout is Saturday night. And these fighters have to make weight. So what do? They weight cut. What does that mean? You can read a lot about it. It's kind of crazy, but what they'll do is, maybe they got to get down from 170 pounds down to 150 pounds for the weigh-in. So they dehydrate, they don't drink anything, they do crazy things to lose all this weight just to make weight. And then what they'll do, maybe drop 10, 15, 20 pounds. But then afterwards, the next 24 hours, they'll make all that weight back with the goal of, once the fight starts, you're heavier than your opponent. You have more mass, which you would think would give you an advantage. However, a lot of weight cutting can be a big disadvantage, because when you drop all that weight, it's unhealthy for your body. There's medical issues. You could have heat stroke or any kind of stroke, exhaustion. It's bad for your kidneys. It can drain your strength and your durability. Your reaction times can be slowed. But Patrick, do you pay attention to the weigh-in, and how can weight cutting be important for new bettors to lean on?
I'm glad you brought it up, Josh. It's not uncommon for a fighter to cut 10% of his body weight over the final 48 hours leading into the weigh-in. And what does this cause? Obviously, dehydration is huge. Physiologically, it plays into it as well. It's just completely fatiguing. And then they go to polar extremes, right? Then after they make the weight, then they'll gorge and they'll try to put the weight back on. You'll see a fighter gain 20 pounds or more. It's a really, really imbalanced way to approach it, but it's so key. And again, you have to be following, there's plenty of sites on Twitter and forums that talk about where a fighter is as far as weight heading into that weigh-in. I'm constantly monitoring, okay, is this guy on track? And if I find out that a fighter isn't on track as far as weight, I start to look for reasons to fade because, again, it's dehydrating, it's fatiguing, and there's a lot of factors that go into it physiologically as well.
Yeah, and really, that's one of the early things, when I first started getting into UFC that I really leaned on. It was kind of a moment of clarity for me, where if you're losing all this mass and all this weight, that's really going to be detrimental to you overall because your body is just totally thrown off kilter. When you're going into a big fight, you kind of want to be even keeled. You want to be consistent with your body, your approach, your mind. So I think it's really important for bettors to focus on that weigh-in. And again, we live in an information age where all this info is out there. So if you can lean on a fighter who's consistent across the board and really his weight's been the same, he hasn't had to do these crazy things to make weight, cut weight, and then gain it all back, that can be a big advantage to lean on overall.
Yep.
Patrick, also, I think another thing I wanted to throw to you was, we always hear the catchphrase that styles make fights. So I think it's important to look for strengths and weaknesses for each fighter. And another thing I learned is that, a lot of fighters with wrestling backgrounds seem to do very well because once you get into the grappling, that foundation of growing up as a wrestler and being a wrestler early on can be a big advantage overall. But do you look for styles, and how can you use styles to your advantage when betting UFC, Patrick?
Yeah. Are you a striker? Are you a grappler? Khabib, who's one of the greats of all time, of course, if he gets you to the ground, I mean, this dude wrestles bears in his off time, if he gets you to the ground. So I'm constantly studying up on ground defense. If you have somebody that wants to take the fight to the ground, what type of fighter defensively is the other fighter? So oftentimes it's just a fighter can be a tremendous fighter and he matches up horrifically against another guy that maybe wants to take it to the ground, or a guy that's not comfortable on his feet and a striker. So constantly looking into the mismatches as far as style is so key.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Patrick. It's almost like, in the NFL when you have a great quarterback and wide receiver and passing game against a really bad, defensive secondary. That can be a big mismatch as well. But yeah, just a couple more betting tips to look out for. The location of the event. This can be kind of overlooked, kind of like weather and officials when we're talking regular betting. But a fighter that arrives early to an event in maybe a different country, gets acclimated to the climate and the culture, that can be a big advantage against the fighter who just got there and is kind of all out of sorts. And then obviously injuries are huge in UFC. Hopefully everyone's healthy, but a lingering injury can be something you want to bet against for a fighter.
Coming up next, right here on the Everything Guide to Sports Betting, a great one. Matt Holt, president of US Integrity, joins us right here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network.